This is part two, continuing on from last time. Since then, the last version I was using was WordPress 3.1, and now it's at version 3.31. So, not much has changed, and this tutorial will still apply for all the WordPress 3 versions, apart from WordPress 4, where some of this information may be incorrect, and versions before WordPress 3. So, just as a warning. And in this tutorial I'm going to be covering the installation functions you can have on a plugin, as well as creating a database. So the first step is, I'm going to do something a bit different with this, and before I start on the actual installation and creating a database table, I'm just going to talk about having a plugin in its own folder, or just having it as a plugin file. So you can see at the minute the project I'm working on is dbsync, and I've got a single file here, but it's actually best to give each plugin its own folder. It's not necessary, but usually if you're creating a plugin that's got quite a bit of information, as well as a lot of different elements like style sheets, JavaScript, images, then you'll just want them all in one folder. So I'm going to create a folder called dbsync. It has to be named exactly the same way as the main plugin file as mentioned in the other tutorial. So I'm just going to drag this in there, and if I reload WordPress now, you'll be able to see it doesn't actually affect anything. So WordPress will know where your plugin is regardless of if it's in a folder like that or just on a file on its own. So now I'm going to move on to the code. So this is what we had last time, which is just the basics of the plugin. Doesn't actually do anything, just comments and information about the plugin. So this time we're going to add an installation function, and this is a hook, so I'm just going to create a comment here saying register all hooks. And now we're going to create a function. Actually, before we do that, we're going to register a hook, because in WordPress, whenever you want to use the hooks it has available, if you're not sure what a hook is, then Google it or check another tutorial on the philosophy related to hooks, and which is normally at MVC. So first thing we need to do is use the WordPress function called register activation hook, which basically means you're telling WordPress to execute a function when the plugin is first installed. So I'm just going to put file as the first parameter, which basically means it's going to use this file as the starting point, and then it's going to look for the function inside this file, which I'm going to call dbsync underscore install. And I'm calling it that because each function for any plugin needs to have a unique name, and the best way to do this is to add a prefix of the main plugin name before the actual function. So that's fine now, and WordPress knows to execute the dbsync install function when the plugin is first activated. So we're just going to create that function now. So function dbsync install, and inside here I'm just going to first mention a few global variables that I want to use inside this plugin. So I'll explain these as I'm typing them. So global WPDB basically is a WordPress variable which you need to announce before you use it, which basically contains your database information for your WordPress site, which you need to use whenever you're interacting with the WordPress database and plugin. and you want to use the database specific to your WordPress installation. So I'm just going to also create another variable here called dbsync db version. So obviously when you create a plugin you have different versions, but the information you may create in a database may be specific to a version, so you'll want to keep track of that and create versions of database information specific to the plugin, so database types, etc. So now that we've got these global variables announced, I'm just going to add another comment. dbsync tasks table. So on the next set of lines, I'm going to be writing all the code to create a table called the tasks table for my plugin. So you may not know what you want in your plugin in terms of how you're going to structure your data and what tables and columns you're going to have, but it's best just to create at least one table to start with and just create some basic information you think you may need in your plugin. So I'm just going to create a table here. So dbsync, then so I'm doing the prefix again, and then I'm writing a shortened acronym of the table I'm working with, which is the task table. Then I'm just going to put table in the end, so I know, just make sure that's only got one underscore. So I know this variable represents the table that I'm working with. And just here I'm going to use the WordPress database variable, and I'm going to get the prefix that my WordPress installation uses, and this will get the prefix any installation uses regardless if it's custom or not. And it's best to do this rather than just doing the normal WP underscore. Some people might not use that prefix in their databases. So now I'm just going to, next to this prefix, I need to have the name of my table, which is dbsync underscore tasks. So let's say my database prefix is WP. It'd basically show up as, well, as that. Obviously, because we're using the prefix variable, we only need to write it without the prefix. Next, we're going to create a variable to store an SQL command in. So I'm just going to call this SQL. And since this is an activation, this is in an activation function, just going to write a function to create a table. We're not actually going to insert any information in this tutorial or talk about that in an activation introduction. Just going to leave it as it is for now on creating an empty table. So just copy this. So we're telling in the SQL statement, create the table and then our table name. And then that's followed by our list of columns. So this table is going to be a list of tasks that my dbsync plugin does. So just doing something, it's still vague on what columns I want, but I'm just going to put some basic columns that most tables would contain. So an ID of the data, and before I do a second column, I'm just going to write what kind of information this will be. So I'll put big int, which means basically a large integer or a big number, and set that to 20, which means Basically, it can be up to 20 digits long. Not null, which means it can't be empty. And auto increment, which means you don't have to set this number, and automatically every time a new piece of information is a new piece of information is inserted into the table, MySQL will automatically create a new number based on all the other numbers that are in the table. So if your first entry has an ID of 1, then MySQL will know the second entry has an ID of 2 without you having to manually type it in or do some logic in the statement. So that's our first column. And then there's another common column to use in any table, which is storing the date and time, which I'm just going to put as time. And then the type of data in that column is date time as mentioned, so you just need to write it as that. And then on this I'm going to use a default variable, and this is basically just going to be a blank time. So there's no way of tracking any actual date to this since everything is at 0. This is just, I'm never expecting a user to not be able to produce any kind of time data if it is being used, but it's just as a backup to avoid any errors, even if it's incorrect. So this with the dashes is obviously the year, the month, and the day, or the year, the day, and the month if you're in America, and the time, which is obviously just hours, minutes, and seconds. Then not null again to make sure it can't return empty. And then I'm going to create another column called task initiator. So just create these on their own lines. And this is called initiator because it's the user that initiates the task. You could call this just task user ID, but initiator seems more appropriate for this plugin. So I'm just going to write integer 2, since we only expect it to be a small amount of users that are going to be on this WordPress installation. And the default would be 0 and not null again. Then the next column is going to be task type with an integer of 32. And this column is basically going to mean what an ID representing the type of command that the plugin may use when syncing. So it's just a general term, well, a way of categorizing storing commands, which will make more sense later on. You don't specifically need to know exactly what it does at the moment. And once again, since it's number, I want a default of 0. Not null again. Real crappy at typing today. Task warnings, which is basically like task type, but it's just returning any, often like when in HTTP problems, when you get say a 404 for a missing page or file, then you may want to produce your own warning numbers for specific types of warnings in your plugin. So this is just a good way of storing them in the database and generalizing them by a number. So integer 32 again, default 0, not null. And that's the last of the columns. But for the last part of the SQL statement, I'm just going to put a unique key, which is the identifier of any data in the table, like the unique identifier, which is task ID. So I'm just going to put that twice. So this is the SQL statement done. So just underneath this we need to put require once. This is just a something you need to do, nothing to do with the tables anymore, that's all finished. This is just to do with the activation function, something you need to consider. I'll explain it once I've finished the code so you can actually see where it makes sense. WP admin includes upgrade.php. So I'm just including the upgrade file of WordPress. So as mentioned with the DB version before, including this file will just help with if someone's used your plugin before and they've stored data which is only relevant to an older version of your plugin, then there'll be some way of dealing with that, which we'll go into further detail in a later tutorial. But it's needed for now. And underneath that, we're just going to add our SQL statement and where it gets executed. So db delta is a WordPress function to execute basically an SQL command. We don't need to worry about dealing with that any further, that's the end of it. So just this part and then this part, and that's all you need to deal with creating a table. And then just another part of dealing with upgrades again. Just grab another WordPress function. So this is just again, this ties in with the require once, and just if there's any problems with the data being out of date compared to what plugin's being used, then it'll add a hook, but not necessarily an implementation yet for dealing with upgrading data. But that's the end of this function, and that should all be fine now. I'll just save as, since I moved my file, so that's why it's coming up wrong in my file editor. So W content plugins, DB sync, save it in there, replace. So now we can go back to activating the plugin. So if I just click activate now, and it should activate fine. And if we go to and you can see there's a table here, as mentioned before, WP underscore DB sync underscore tasks, which is the table that's just been created in the function I've just wrote. And you can see all the columns. And if I just try to insert some data into here now, so let's just put some random numbers. Don't really mean anything yet, it's just showing what kind of data we would be dealing with, like random data. And you can see, just back onto the table, that it goes in fine, and just everything with creating the table, the function, all the code there works perfectly and just serves its purpose. So that's the end of this tutorial, and just watch out for the next ones.